earliest texts in the ecclesiastical tradition, Clement's letter to the Corinthians, begins, "The Church of our Lord sojourning in Rome to the Church of our Lord sojourning in Corinth." The Greek term which I'm translating as sojourning is a term with very precise meaning. It designates the manner in which foreigners and those in exile dwell. It is opposed to another Greek verb which designates how a citizen of a city, state, kingdom, or empire dwells. This is the formula I've chosen to begin my address to the Church of our Lord in sojourn or exile here in Paris. This is how Giorgio Agamben began his address at Notre Dame de Paris, which has been published in a short book called The Church in the Kingdom. So we're joined by Chris, aka Young Agamben, and Keanu, aka Keanu.
Yeah, my name's Chris, or Young Agamben on Twitter, part of the Decode podcast.
My name's Keanu Hidari, at Wotu Chorazin on Twitter.
We decided to talk today about this text because it concerns a topic that's very interesting and something that I think should be fleshed out, which is this concept of messianic time. So Keanu or Chris, would you like to tackle what is messianic time and what is the context of this address?
I think messianic time is juxtaposed to eschatological time. Eschatological time would be the fact of things ending, the fact that the temporality of the end itself, whereas the messianic time it's the experience of the end time itself. It's the time in between, the time that remains between the resurrection event and the parousia. This messianic time is time that's redeemed by Jesus, time that's redeemed by the spiritual and material revolutionary consequences of the resurrection itself. So that's what I took from Agamben to be messianic time. I think there are a lot of other layers we can unpack as well.
Absolutely. And I think messianic time, according to St. Paul, is the sort of lexical ordering of a time after time or an end time instead of what he calls as the penultimate, or what you just call the time that remains. It's almost like a ontological reordering of how you should look at time in a way that, as St. Paul says, he uses a word that Agamben translates to almost destroys or annihilates the penultimate in favor of the ultimate, or that messianic time.
So previously on forums, we've had a couple different episodes that have tried to make sense of Christian tradition. And one of the things that's the most incongruous or sort of difficult to understand is when you read the New Testament, like when you read the letters of Paul or when you read Acts, there's this wild and radical form of life present where people have, enacted communism in their own time. And the church has this sort of spiritual energy and material practices that, historically speaking, seem to have abated. In the last episode we recorded with David Bentley Hart, we kind of went into the historiography of this and kind of thinking about, how did we get from people literally having no possessions to a denunciation of possessions to today where we have like an endorsement of possessions, right? So there's this kind of decline and fall of the Christian mission or witness, historically speaking. And what we're looking at, at the present time, as we've discussed before, is this sort of post-Christian era. And it's very interesting that Agamben comes to Notre Dame and, says, "I'm here to talk to the church sojourning in Paris." So maybe, before we get into the depths of the temporality, can one of you talk about this conception of the sojourning or the exile and what that means in Agamben's work?
Yeah, I think this is quite important to the entirety of the speech Agamben is giving. And I think that comes from, as we read in the beginning, that he begins the speech by using the idea of the church sojourning in the letter to the Corinthians, but also the church sojourning in Paris as he's giving this speech. And so I think there's a lot to unpack when it comes to Agamben's concept of the sojourner. And I think for me, at least, it comes down to what the church is and what the church calls one to do. And in that way, it's a vocation in many ways. The church is a vocation towards the ultimate, the end time. And in that sense, your time in this world, or your time in the time that remains, is merely a sojourn. In other words, this is not your home. This is not, the vocation of the church is not to build things in the material world. It's to sojourn into the material world in this vocation of dealing with things that are the ultimate or the messianic stage of time.
Something I really like Chris, that comes out of the first few pages of the address is this notion that parochial time, parochial comes from the word parish, and there's an association, a lexical association there. And parish refers to the sojourn of a foreigner.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of my own religious formation dealt with seeing the church as exiles, seeing the church as pilgrims on the way, so to speak. And I think there's a call to action in Agamben's address that seems to suggest, like you said, the church has lost its way. The church has lost its vocation from pursuing this kind of temporality of the sojourn of the foreigner.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, that the church is supposed to be a church in exile. And I think it speaks to the position of church philosophers or theologians like Agamben, or maybe even Simone Weil, that they are exiles from the church. In this sort of turn, the church has become highly orthodox and institutionalized. And in many ways, there is now a foreign church. There's an exiled church, a church in exiled, and then there's the real church, so to speak, the institutional church that has sort of become obviously a major power in the material world and is no longer just a place for the exiles, so to speak.
It's interesting that you brought up the conception of the church becoming orthodox, because I think what that term means, or what do we have in mind by that, is sort of something that's kind of under theorized even by people who uphold the sense of tradition. To me, rather than the orthodoxy per se, the issue seems to be this accord or peace, the social peace that's been declared between, for example, the church and the Roman Empire, or the church and the French Republic, or, whatever context you want to give it, where it's really not in exile. It's not sojourning. And in a sense, I think this essay, or the speech rather, is very poignant because it looks towards the future of what it would mean to be a Christian, at least in, the West, where we really are coming to a post-Christian moment. And as you see, like, a lot of people can't take it. Like, a lot of people, the wheels are coming off, not only of Christians kind of losing their minds and becoming sort of like wild reactionaries, but also from secular people just divorcing themselves from any standard of morality and just kind of doing, ethically whatever, just go for it, I guess. And I think this is a place where, as a Christian, I personally feel very strange and alienated. And at least in France, where I live, I find a lot of solidarity with my Muslim neighbors, because I feel like in this sense, we're both kind of strange. We're both kind of weird. And I think that weirdness, or that outsideness, or that strangeness is really important. There's something about this accord with society that comes historically through Christian theology and practice time and again, of like, what is the church's relationship with slavery, right? What is the church's relationship with, I don't know, the institution of the Roman army, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Agamben is very interesting in the way that he addresses this. So if somebody wants to talk about kind of this conception of the vocation, and the vocation that revokes the vocation, and the messianic vocation, do either of you want to take on this vocational aspect?
I think once I was confronted with the idea of vocation, I think what I automatically went to right away is the resonance that Agamben's language in this address has with what I study, which is apocalyptic theology, or that I dabble in it. And apocalyptic theology is it's not what he's talking about here in the sense of apocalyptic time. It's all about messianic time. Apocalyptic theology is, so just so that I don't confuse the listener. So once we have in mind the difference between messianic time and apocalyptic time, and I'll just reiterate it for you, where messianic time is referring to this kind of transformational practice of metanoia, where the church is being renewed in its confrontation with the end. Paul calls it, the church's activity in the present evil age. Apocalyptic time is, as Agamben says, the apocalyptic thinker is found on the last day, judgment day. He or she sees the end of time and describes what is seen. But messianic time is not the end of time, but the time of the end. And I would say, when I think about the recent work in New Testament scholarship in apocalyptic theology, I think a lot about this notion that Agamben is talking about, which is, he says, it's perfectly clear that to live in the time that remains, to experience the time of the end, can only mean a radical transformation of our experience of time. And that notion of a radical transformation of our experience of time suggests to me that the way we are living now vocationally is radically disjunct, is radically dissociated from the, some would say, the primitive church, is radically dissociated from the early church understanding of expectation, of Advent. So we live in this interadvental period where we're expecting Christ to return imminently. But as Agamben mentions earlier, he considers it blasphemous, this idea that there has been a delay of the parousia, there has been a delay of the return of Christ. Rather, he waits with expectant longing of the imminent return of Christ. And that's that apocalyptic hope of New Testament studies that we're trying to get back to, not this socially liberal accommodationism or, appeasement theology, you could call it.
I think Agamben does a very good job of making this argument too, not just in this work, but in his writing on what he calls the apparatus. I think he does a very good job of drawing in sort of, like you're saying, Keanu, he uses Hegel's idea of sort of natural religion versus the institutional religion to talk about how the institutional side of religion is sort of the apparatus, the set of circumstances that turn into just accommodation towards the material world. The necessary sort of institutional survival in the material world becomes the dominant form of the church, whereas the sort of messianic church is somewhere hidden in that. And in many ways, I think Agamben is right to argue for a Christianity that in the Hegelian sense is more natural, so to speak. But I think in many ways, the fact that the church has sublated or subsumed or excommunicated a lot of the more heretical strains of Christian thought, in many ways, like we were kind of speaking about earlier, I think there's this crisis in the church right now where I sort of see the revenge of Manichaeanism of sorts, where the church itself has become this massive, massive material power. In many senses, it's sort of the policeman of the material world. So in many ways, these heretical sects that have been conquered, so to speak, by the church, I think are coming back now as the church has sort of lost its true vocation, even in sort of like the QAnon extreme of there being some sort of deep evil materiality of this world. But I think more specifically to Agamben, it's the inevitable evil of the apparatus that needs to be sort of dealt with in a way that orders the ultimate, the things that deal with the time of the end instead of dealing with the power of the church in the time that remains.
Something that's really interesting is when he talks about this relation between the penultimate and the ultimate, between the now and the not yet, is that he is very strong speaking about it's not an abolition, it's not a destruction, it's not an annihilation, it's a transformation. And you can't simply negate the present in favor of the future, right? We can't actually do this kind of operation where we force Christ to return and end time, right? You can't actually just there's not a lever you can pull to make that happen. Rather, there's this transformation of our daily life, of what's going on now. And for me, it's very interesting because it's kind of in tension with a lot of political radicalism, where you think that, for example, we can make this event, right? We can force the event to reveal itself, or there's this strange. On the one hand, I feel like what he's saying in this essay is very uncomfortable to any kind of liberal or conservative, but it's also uncomfortable for the radical because it's not clear. It's not immediately clear what is this transformation, what does this consist of? And for me, I think this, in this sense, the essay or the talk is very sophiological. What do you make of this?
I think about this idea of transformation in terms of being linked to messianic time as it's not some other time. In fact, he says this integral transformation of chronological time, it's an ultimate experience of last things. It's experiencing those things, the very same things, those penultimate things differently. And I think it is very much sociological in the sense that I almost think that there are, Chris mentioned the Hegelian overtones here. This very interesting idea of look at, it goes back to Bonhoeffer as well, when he was writing his letters and papers in prison. You look at the atrocity of the situation. You look at the catastrophe of modern life, and you ask yourself, what can I do to change things? I think the answer that someone like Dostoevsky, the answer that someone like Bonhoeffer, the answer that someone like Agamben would give is that you need to begin, not necessarily in some Jordan Peterson-esque way with, clean up your room, transform yourself, but there needs to be a change in perception. There needs to be a fundamental reorientation of the way we understand cognitively what we do and how we think about what we do. And that transformation, I think, is an essential component to any kind of radical change or, political, activism or whatever. We need to have a change of what the stakes of this conversation actually are.
And it's even more extreme than that, because it's not just a question of, okay, how do we apply Christian faith, or how does the church relate to politics? Agamben argues in this speech that if you're not in, the only place the church is in that messianic time. Where the sojourning is, there is the Messiah and there is the church. If you're not in the sojourning, if you're not with the Messiah, there's no church. It doesn't exist. I just feel like this is a really core claim. And I think this is also like, why is Christianity in decline? Maybe it's not in decline, it's just disappearing. The less and less that it's in this messianic time, the less and less, it's just sort of winding down. It's withering away. What do you make of this, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's very well put, Keanu. And I'll sort of just jump off of that and say that I think it's actually the stakes for the sort of political project of someone like Agamben or a radical of any kind is very much tied with the stakes of the church. And, you can start with the idea that messianic time comes from this Benjamin notion that is quasi-religious, but it's also quasi-political, right? It's time is shot through with the messianic time of also the political liberation, or the sort of this final communism in many senses. And if we look at it that way, the role of the church and the role of, say, a politically radical communist revolution are slightly similar. There's almost an apocalyptic and messianic aspect to true revolutionary organizations or revolutionary parties. But then we have this issue that these sort of political institutions will face the exact same problems as the church, that they will favor penultimate things, start to favor material power in the real world instead of this sort of messianic hope to actually find liberation. It will just become sort of another church. And I think Simone Weil is sort of the clearest when it comes to this, when she says that, she was never part of the Communist Party because she found the Communist Party to be basically the church, just even better at its excommunication. And basically, I think the idea of the church as an institution, the issues that we have to deal with in the religious institution are not completely congruent, but they're quite similar to the sort of messianic impulse of our political movements.
So we've talked about the church, and we talked about history and the kind of this conception of penultimate and ultimate and messianic time and apocalyptic moment, etc. We haven't really talked about the kingdom. Keanu or Chris, if you want, can one of you tackle this second part of the title of the kingdom? How does the church relate to the kingdom?
I think that once we think about Paul's idea of the kingdom, Agamben is very insistent to say that the time of the Messiah cannot be a future thing. You're going to have to forgive my devastatingly bad Greek pronunciation, but the paroika and the parousia are actually syntagmatically related in the sense of having the preposition para. And he says it's a presence that distends time, and already that is also a not yet. He says it's a delay that does not put off until later, but instead a disconnection within the present moment that allows us to grasp time. And so to me, the notion of a sojourning church that has the same structure, temporally speaking, as the very return of Jesus Christ himself says something to me about what it means to understand temporality messianically. And to me, I think a degree of detachment is necessary. We have to detach ourselves from the kingdom of the world. And I think that later on in the address, he will talk about the question of history itself. And he mentions that there is a kind of interesting dichotomy that operates in the logic of history, one that he calls law state. That's one part of the binary. And the other part of the binary is Messiah church. But the dialectic of law, state, Messiah church operating together creates this, he calls it the signature of the economy of salvation. It creates this tension. And the church operates in the midst of that tension in history.
Is that a dialectic, or is that an antinomy?
That's a great question. I think in the text itself, he uses the word, he says, the only way that a community can form and last is if these poles are present and the dialectical tension between them prevails.
I mean, it makes sense if you think about the sort of historical schema in broad strokes, where this penultimate moment, I mean, we have, the gospel, just historically, the events of the gospel are kind of behind us. The events of the ultimate restoration of the world are before us. So there's really no point in having a sojourning church unless you're sojourning somewhere, you're not just sojourning in like the void. So you need to have this kind of contrasting elements. And I think this is kind of helpful also when we look at what certain Christian thinkers are proposing in our present time. If you look at like the Rod Dreyers and their Benedict option, it seems like there's a loss or a miscalculation of the relationship of these elements. And sometimes it can be hard to enunciate exactly what seems off or what seems wrong, unless you have this kind of language, which is, to be fair, there's a lot of terminology in here that needs to be unpacked. But I mean, Chris, what do you make of this kind of double movement or this double aspect of history?
Yeah, I think it gets very complicated in many ways. I think first, let me just sort of speak on what Keanu was saying and explain what Agamben means by sort of the economy of salvation. In many ways, this is sort of the point of the church, is to provide a structure, an economy of salvation. And Agamben's major gripe with the church comes from the economy of salvation started by St. Augustine when he translates that man inherited both death and sin from Adam. And Agamben argues, under this framework, then man can never really reach sort of a salvation in the real world because they're never going to work off that original sin. So they have to pay the church in both, prayers, money, power in the material world. So that economy of salvation favors the power of the church in the material world, whereas he wants
the famous mistranslation in Romans when it was brought into Latin, is it not?
Precisely. So Agamben argues that actually it says that all we did is inherit death from Adam, and then through death we inherit sin, but it's our own sin. It's not the sin of Adam that we have to work off. So in many ways, he wants to argue that the economy of salvation is wrong, is meant to sort of keep people under a system of power in many ways. And he wants to sort of reinterpret the economy of salvation to make it something that you're actually working towards at any given moment, right? Through time. It has to be shot through with that messianic time. It's not like you're just trapped in the material world because someone you never knew or, some higher being made a mistake and now you're living out its hell, so to speak.
This is actually one of the reasons why I found this essay so interesting, is because I had been reading a lot in like the Russian sophiologists and in, generally speaking, Eastern Christianity, because we never had this Latin translation issue. This economy of salvation didn't exist per se, right? This was, Augustine's soteriology was just not the foundation. And so when you get into like the modern period, you have this vision of like, when I'm reading this essay, I keep thinking about Bulgakov and his constant prayer of Maranatha, like, come Lord Jesus. Like for him, this is the key Christian prayer. This is like the ultimate expression of like Christian faith in a sense. This is the sort of insight of Agamben. I'm not aware if Agamben had any, readings of these people or not. I would be interested to find out one of these days. But I think the sophiological work of restoring the world, you're right. It requires a review. I don't know how you can do that if you maintain this heavy Augustinian soteriology. I just don't think it makes sense, or at least it's obstructed. I don't know. What do you make of this, Keanu? You're a good Augustinian.
I always bring it back to the question of history. And there is a passage in this text that puzzled me significantly. And it's on page 40, where Agamben says, nowhere on earth today is a legitimate power to be found. Even the powerful are convinced of their own illegitimacy. And I think that the notion of secular culture becoming this parodic, mimetic representation of the church's, he says, incessant deferral of the last judgment seems to me to be the state of things, the very tragic, sad state of things at the moment.
Well, I just want to read one passage from that page because this is wild.
Sure.
So, he talks about the incessant deferral of the last judgment and then says, with the eclipse of the messianic experience of the culmination of the law and of time comes an unprecedented hypertrophy of law, one that under the guise of legislating everything betrays its legitimacy through legalistic excess. And I think that is like definitely, I mean, I don't know. It seems to me, in 2021, very clear that this is operative. What do you make of this, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I want to read a quote off of that and also just sort of tie in this idea of the argument being made about history here and how it might tie into more than just the church. I like what he says on page 34 going into 35, and I'll just read this. In the eyes of the church fathers, as well as the eyes of those philosophers who have reflected on the philosophy of history, which is and remains an essentially Christian discipline, history is presented as a field traversed by two opposing forces. The first of these forces, which Paul, in a passage to the second letters to the Thessalonians, that is as famous as it is enigmatic, calls to katikon, maintains and ceaselessly defers the end along the linear and homogeneous line of chronological time. By placing origin and end in contact with one another, this force endlessly fulfills and ends time. Let us call this force law or state, dedicated as it is to economy, which is to say, dedicated as it is to the indefinite and indeed infinite governance of the world. As for the second force, let us call it Messiah or church. Its economy is the economy of salvation, and by this token is essentially completed. The only way that a community can form and last is if these poles are present and a dialectical tension between them prevails. I think that quote is the clearest kernel of the dialectical process of history there, where he really kind of lays out what the dialectical tension between the origin and the end, or the messianic and the law.
One of the interesting things about secularism or of like liberal democracy is that it's not just, the much bandied about end of history, but it's this infinite nature of history. There's no necessary end in sight, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no ultimate. And I think that is a key insight. It's circulating commodities forever and ever.
Mm-hmm. Even spiritual commodities,
Yeah, but like until the sun like blows up or whatever. But even then, you've got people that want to like colonize space. What do you make of this?
Towards the end of the address, he talks about, he has a really interesting quote, which is that it's on page 40. He talks about the complete juridification and commodification of human relations, the confusions between what we might believe, hope, and love, and that which we are obliged to do or not do, say or not say, are signs, not only of crises of law and state, but also and above all of crises of the church. This is where it gets interesting for me. The reason for this is that the church can be a living institution only on the condition that it maintains an immediate relation to its end, which I assume Agamben means the eschatological end in messianic time. He says, and at a point which we would do well not to forget, according to Christian theology, there is only one legal institution which knows neither interruption nor end: hell. The model of contemporary politics, which pretends to an infinite economy of the world, is thus truly infernal. And if the church curtails its original relation with the paroikia, it cannot but lose itself in time. And his charge to the church is, will the church finally grasp the historical occasion and recover its messianic vocation, or will it be swept away in the garbage bin of history? And to me, that question of confronting the secular culture's parody of the original heresy of the church, which is for Agamben, the blasphemy that the parousia, the second coming, is endlessly deferred. Right? Once the church can get away from this kind of already not yet mentality that displaces the urgency of the second coming, once we get to a place where we're interested in institutions of power, structures, and money and bureaucracy, we've missed the point. Not that you can have an institution that doesn't have those things, but all of this is what Paul would say is adiaphora, of secondary importance. What matters is the the eschaton. What matters is the apocalypse, the revelation of Jesus Christ in space and time, and him showing himself as the way, the truth, and the life. And the church that abandons this message in hope of temporal power creates the conditions under which a secular culture parodies, mirrors, reflects the church's own heresy. And we see that in what Agamben is calling the infernal, hellish state of consumption, the state of, what is it called? The state of exception, where the dialectical tension between law and Messiah is abandoned in favor of this infernal, endlessly recursive state of suffering.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And I think it's very difficult. And I think Simone Weil really points out the paradox of that very well when she points out that the church should deal with the ultimate things, right? And the church should be this vocational thing. And yet you have this dialectical force where the church needs to become an institution to be able to pass its orthodoxy through time. The problem is that, as Simone Weil used to call any organization, the beast. Any collective organization is going to start perpetuating itself in its own interest and no longer the interest of God, because it'll start to realize that it's a material institution with a messianic end that it can never fulfill. So it'll keep expanding its power, trying to, finally make it get what it considers enough power to fulfill what its original desire was, which it sees as sort of a failure of power. But in reality, the idea of creating an institution is necessary for any church to succeed, right? You need to have some sort of connection through time. But paradoxically, when you're doing that, you're slowly degrading what was sort of mystical or natural about that religion, what was sort of the core fundamental vocation of that institution is slowly being degraded, is slowly tending towards the infernal, simply not because it's bad, not because it's morally bad, but because of this dialectical tension that's always going to be there.
I think there's sort of an interesting, I'm going to take a small exception with what you just said, Chris, which, when I first encountered Eastern Orthodoxy, one of the things, I forget who told me this or if I read it somewhere, but somebody said that the church is not an institution. It has an institution. That this institutional scaffold exists to serve the church. The church is actually like a living community. It's a form of life. So in this sense, it's not that the Christianity is not passed through the institution historically. The institution is a kind of tool that the church has that could, in theory, be disposed with, I suppose. I mean, I don't know if that would occur or not, but that it's in the collective work of the church is what is propelling it. And you have this kind of, this might be like a particularly Orthodox emphasis, but it's coming together and doing the liturgy and being together and sharing the Eucharist and being in that moment where we maintain our connection to the ultimate and to each other. That's how actually the community is sort of defined, is you can only participate in this relation to the ultimate if you are like a member of the community. Right. And that's that's actually how you tell is somebody part of the community or not, do they commune with the ultimate and with one another? And so I think this is a kind of interesting question because we've basically talked about most of the ideas in the book. And I'm thinking about, okay, well, what are the implications of this? Right. What would it mean to have this different experience of messianic time? What would it mean to avoid this kind of fate of, as he says, being swept away by the disaster menacing every government and institution on earth, right? And I think well, actually, I'll just toss it to both of you. What do you think about these practical implications?
When I think about practical implications from the church and the kingdom, I think about bare life and the concept of Zoe. One of the, and this Henry might forecast to a future episode you might do in the future about another work of Agamben's, his Where Are We Now, about the pandemic as politics, right? And I think the notion of bare life to me is deeply situated in the historical experience of what Agamben has been talking about, which is this secular parody of the church's heretical blasphemy, that the parousia is delayed. In that heretical historicity, what we have is ultimately a stripped down biomedical, consumerist, densely capitalist, delusion rhizomatic nightmare, a hellish landscape of endless circuits of mimetic consumption, endless circles of biomedical imperialism, where we're only concerned with our bare survival, and that's bare life. And I think if Agamben were to reconfront this text today, it would be ultimately a question of what would the church do to confront this kind of survival fetishism? What institutions, practices, dispositif, circuits of power, grassroots organization, what have you? What does the church need to do to fight back against this assault on Zoe, this assault on the human, what is truly human?
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I think it goes back to what Henry was saying, in that I think the practical implications for me are the form of life implications for both me as an individual, or a sojourner as an individual, but also the form of life the church should take. In many ways, if, as Agamben says, the apparatus is inevitable, you're always going to be captured by one. What should it look like? What's the best, most vital apparatus that's going to keep us from that infernal push?
That immediately evokes to me this ongoing conflict within the Church of England about the role of the parish itself. There's this kind of campaign to, one might say marginalize, one might say refocus, whatever, but the parish as a kind of location of Christian community is at the very least being put aside in favor of some other experiments in how the church can, meet people, or maybe, conduct itself in like a cafe or something. And I wonder, to what degree is the local church really a parish in the sense that Agamben is talking about? Is it really a sort of location of sojourning? Is that really what we see? Or does the local church look like, I don't know, does it look like a TED Talk? Does it look like a Starbucks? Does it look like a third place?
I think as the church has become less and less a place for sort of vital spiritual needs, it's driven itself further and further into becoming the exact opposite, where it tends to be suppressive of sort of the spiritual impulse in many ways. I think it's inevitable, but there's this thing now where you see almost a competition for what the parish might be. In other words, you have sort of the parody of the church, as Keanu has brought up, but in an attempt to return to what the church used to do. So just for example, like maybe the Kanye West, Sunday service, which tries to sort of strip down and recreate what the church was, especially in its early days, this sort of just like communal gathering of singing and prayer, that in many ways, just like almost like the business world, it's taking this almost disruption, right? This competition by these small sects of heretical religious organizations, whether they be Christian or otherwise, who are trying to sort of fill the space that the church has sort of suffocated away from spiritual people. And so the church sees fewer people in the pews and fewer dollars in the box, because people are either dropping out of the church and hoping to find something, or actively seeking something new, something that will recreate what the church once did, which is leading to both interesting and highly problematic, highly predatory organizations that are kind of filling that void.
Keanu, as an Anglican, what do you make of this parish question?
Well, I always like to clarify that I'm in TEC, and so whatever the Anglicans are doing in the UK, that's their business. But I think I really do believe that the whole synodality question regarding parishes is a troubling sign of neoliberalism infecting the church.
What do you mean by the synodality question?
So I was referring to the kind of arguments, I suppose, now happening in TEC as well, but in the UK Anglican Church, this question of to what extent should local level parishes have control over the administration and the bureaucracy of the church? Should we even meet in church buildings? Should we have priests?
Mhm.
Should we have, like, these are questions that are being asked in the contemporary Anglican Church, and it's a little bit disturbing for me. It's
Mhm.
disturbing not because, and you would think, oh well, you're a leftist radical. Shouldn't you be all about deconstructing the church? Shouldn't you be all about having more parity between the lay people and the hierarchy? And I would say it's a parody of equality, of egalitarianism. It's a parody of these things. Why is it a parody? When you turn the church into a business, you have to have business ethics. And what are business ethics today except identity politics and representationalism, right?
Mm.
The Church of England had this thing that said they want, I have to verify the statistic somewhere, so I'm not going to throw out a number, but they said a certain percentage of their membership has to be people of color. And I'm a person of color myself, right? But what is the vast majority of the British population at this point, right? It's when you use this identity politics schema to argue for meaningful change, you're basically replicating the logic of business ethics into transforming the church. It's not going to work. The whole parish conversation in the Anglican Communion is not about really getting more butts in seats. It's about making the church a modern organization that conforms to neoliberal business practices.
Mm-hmm.
And
not
whether
to push you too hard on this, but is not the Archbishop of Canterbury himself a former oil executive?
Is he actually?
Yeah, Justin Welby.
Yeah, Justin Welby is okay. I mean,
he worked, like, he had a business career where he was managing, I think it was like a French and international, like, oil exploitation projects in Africa and the North Sea and things like this.
I didn't know that, but
before he became a minister, right? So I'm not here to condemn him or something. It's fitting that you would have this critique of, like, a sort of business. I mean, I can't think of a more fitting, like, neoliberal, this is really the like, bring in business management and then organize the church according to those lines. No,
you're absolutely right, and thank you for bringing that up. I didn't know that. It strikes me as deeply and profoundly ironic, like how members of the Supreme Court in the United States are stacked former Monsanto executives, former oil lobbyists. Like, there's just a real sense in which the professional managerial class is infecting our religious establishments and institutions. And if we're really worried about parity, equality, having the voice of the laity give their actual opinions, why don't we actually listen to what the laity are saying? The laity are not saying, let's destroy our churches and build coffee shops. Nobody is saying that.
Don't build the coffee shops, meet in the coffee shop. It's more agile than that, right? Because you don't have any of the overhead of the building.
There you go.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, as a Roman Catholic, the moment of realization for me was reading. Have you ever read about the P2 Masonic Lodge that happened in Italy? So obviously, during the sort of like 60s through 80s in Italy, you have the years of lead. So you have the CIA doing this thing called Operation Gladio, where they had a ton of terrorist neo-fascist networks that were supposed to be there to stop an invasion by the communists, right? But the communists never came. So it turned into a psychological warfare operation where the CIA would, like, give bombs to neo-fascists, and then they would pretend to be Marxists and they would bomb. And it was called the strategy of tension. So we have that going on, right? So it turns out that the P2 Masonic Lodge was a meeting of mobsters, high institutionally important church members, and the CIA. So this was like their secret organization. And it turns out they were using the church under Ratzinger, when he was a bishop, to simultaneously funnel money from the CIA drug running operations, right? In, like, Laos and the CIA. The cocaine money is coming through the church to the CIA, and then the CIA is sending money through the church to fund bombings of, random civilians in Germany and in Italy. So all of a sudden, the church operates ostensibly like a neo-fascist intelligence agency, right? Like, how can you associate yourself with that kind of institution? Or how can you see that kind of institution accommodating, like, a neoliberal, almost like, identity politics basis, and be like, aren't these the same people that gave bombs to neo-fascists,
In the afterword to the book, there's this piece called On Method, the Messiah, Anarchy, and Theocracy. Mm-hmm. And on page 52, there's this line by the author that says, what he, meaning Agamben, sees, for instance, through the seemingly self-evident terms parish and sojourn and their common Greek root, is a lost calling, a loss of a sense for the idea of time, which infused early Christian thought and in which its messianic element was most alive. I'm going to harp on my hobby horse for a second of apocalyptic theology, if only because I think that New Testament studies today is receiving a renaissance. It's receiving a new birth by a sort of renewed focus of attention on what it means for God to reveal himself to his people. And I think there are properly sociological dimensions to this, but at base is talking about what is charismatic, what is the proclamation of the church. The proclamation of the church must not begin with anything other than the facticity of the person and work of Jesus Christ. Meaning that in historical time and space, a Palestinian man was murdered by the Roman state, and 200 or so people saw him flying in the sky sometime afterward. Mm. And this narrative of the whole Christ event is the anchoring point from which all further theological statements, be they dogmatic or adiaphora, can be made. If we begin our theological praxis by statements about sin, statements about anthropology and Genesis, statements about the overall structure of natural theology, what have you, we're missing the fundamental. We're missing apocalypse if we begin on a foundation that is classically called modernist or foundationalist.
Right.
So that would be my sales pitch for apocalyptic theology, so to speak.
I have a question for you, Keanu, because I've always tried to figure out how this might kind of fit into this argument in Agamben's other book, Garden in the Kingdom. And he basically takes the line of the Brothers of the Free Spirit, sort of heretical sect, who he says he uses the Garden of Earthly Paradise painting. And he says, this isn't just like a painting, this is an argument for the simultaneity of the kingdom and the garden, that this is like one simultaneous thing. And that it's an amazing concept to me. But I was wondering, in terms of sort of apocalyptic theology, what implications does that kind of argument have, the simultaneity of the garden and the kingdom?
This is something that folks as diverse as John Barclay, N.T. Wright, Douglas Campbell have argued upon. Basically, the question is, what do we do with the already and the not yet? How do we explain suffering? What is our theodicy, right? What is our explanation of suffering in light of the fact that the inbreaking of the covenant, the inbreaking of the kingdom has begun? My answer to this question comes not from classical theism, but borrowing from Orthodox theology's commitment to what you might call pan-end theism. God is in the world is in God, as well as from liberation theology. Now, why do I bring up liberation theology? Not to say that I have any fantastical conceptions of the Trinity or can make any statements about gender or what have you, but I do want to say that Elie Wiesel, who wrote the book Night, has a very moving scene in that book. Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, novelist. There's a scene in which Elie Wiesel is standing in line, and this summary is a butchery of what actually the book says. It's my vague recollection, right? He's standing in line, and there's 2 or 3 people ahead of him in line. And to his right, there's a gallows. There's 2 people being hanged. And then on the far left, there's a little boy who's being hanged. The person in front of Elie Wiesel starts having a mental breakdown and says, God, where are you? And the little boy whose face is turning blue on the gallows, who's slowly dying, Elie Wiesel looks at his face and says, that's the face of God. So the face of God is in the dying, helpless child that was murdered in Auschwitz. What do we do with that then? What do we do with that? I think what it is recognizing that in the logic of the kingdom, the values that we evaluate, it's kind of like, this is an ironic reparsing of Nietzsche's reevaluation of all values, right? That the kingdom narrative asks us to completely overturn the dynamics of thought that we had in this world that's stained by Adam and the fall. That means whomever is powerful, we regard them as last. Whoever is weak, we regard them as first. Whoever is spiritually poor, we accord them mercy, grace, and richness. Whoever is spiritually fulfilled must weep with those who are weeping. And that's the kind of Pauline, the Pauline antimonies that we have in his letters, where he says in Corinthians, the time is coming. Those who are weeping are going to laugh, and those who are laughing are going to weep. And it's this kind of apocalyptic language here. And so I think it required, Agamben's onto something with this address. I fundamentally believe that.
There's something really powerful in it. There's something about this. I keep coming back to the practical, like what would it mean to transform the time or our perception of the time, right? What would that actually mean? I think about things I've done in my life and things I've tried and, participated in, etc. And I think whether we're considering COVID governance or just, the everyday administration of fear, as Paul Virilio put it, or these different things, there's need to impose on the world, right? There's this need to overtake it or overshadow it. Even in like some, Marxist discourse or whatever, there's some desire to impose upon externally. And what I'm getting from Agamben and what I feel like I get from the sociologists is this attention to the inside out nature of it as well. And I'm thinking now of the passage about cooking, cutting up oxen, right? And there's this kind of sublime, like you learn how to care for life through through learning to put your knife into the hollows and not touching the main joint. And I think that there's something here, but it's kind of difficult to describe or to explain. But at least in my own, personal political practice, I've tried to become very marginal, to try to become as like marginal as possible. And in this sense, remove myself from even the temptation of, getting caught up in like the affairs as if there's something that I should do to the world, like I should seize the world or do something of this nature, right? So you're kind of, it reminds me in Republic when they talk about how exile is really maybe the only condition that somebody could be a philosopher, right? Is you have to, like the exile is probably, you either need the divine sign, which not everybody can get, you need to be somehow crippled, or go into exile. It's like the three good paths to really do philosophy. But it's, as a political program, it's kind of difficult because when we talk about a political program or some kind of, actionable thing, okay, here's the takeaway. People want like typically some kind of list of exoteric, things that they can do externally to fix or change or whatever. I'm not really sure how to express it myself, but I feel like this essay it really forces one to confront that question.
Yeah, for me, practically, I think it really does have a political implication in that it reminds me that the reorientation of time is also a reorientation towards my, view of institutions in the material world, especially political institutions. And it makes me realize that the things that are eternal, maybe the good, the just, the beautiful, institutions should be the servants of those things and not simply the ends themselves. In many ways, I think that institutions have kind of like convinced us that they are the end, this sort of just empty time movement of just sort of doing what the institution's material ends are is basically what modern society is. And I think there's something quite revolutionary in orienting yourself towards those eternal qualities or spiritual qualities, because it allows you to look at the institutions that we've been given in our time and say, this isn't good enough, right? Or this isn't serving what I want, right? This isn't serving human vitality or spiritual growth or what humanity should be putting first or the church should be putting first. In many ways, it allows you to take that, imperative that St. Paul gives us for the penultimate things and to transform them into something that's actually pointed towards the ultimate.
Perhaps I can give an expression, at least in terms of an image of what I was trying to express a moment ago, which is during the first serious lockdown of coronavirus, mm-hmm. my wife and I would hike up to this monastery that was not yet even built. It was like in the process of being built. And we would go on the forest footpaths, and it would just be us and the two monks in this half-finished church where there's like, for an altar area, they've got like the table, but like the side table is just like a weird, I don't know, some like IKEA thing that they rummaged, and there's no paint, and like the floor is just plywood. And it really felt like the end of the world. And there's this sort of anecdote about Father Bulgakov that when he served in the altar, it was kind of awkward. Like he moved around, but it wasn't like necessarily smooth, the movements. And one had the feeling of like, this was like the first liturgy that had ever been done. And in a sense, it's also the end, right? It's this kind of jerky, incongruous thing where you're just looking, it's like, we have two lay people, we have two priests, we're going to do church and then go eat together afterward. And, I had an occasion to meet with those monks again lately, and they're slowly growing a community. They're slowly finishing the church. They're slowly building up the garden. They're slowly kind of making the connections, reviving the small village that was dead. And I feel that obviously there's all kinds of things people can do in life, but I think that that's kind of the basic image of restoring the world, for me at least, of what it looks like practically. Like maybe the best you can do is find a brother monk and, move to this kind of semi-abandoned zone and just try to build a real community there.
I think part of the difficulty of looking at practical steps is that this is something that is very often discussed in Protestant Reformed circles, where once we begin to talk about steps in sanctification, you're kind of quickly accused of legalism. And while I think that's a bit of an excessive overcorrection, I do think there's a kernel of truth in fears of prescribing too much about what implications should look like. I think the first thing with an apocalyptic mindset is to remember this is in God's hands. God is in control. Once we understand what it means for God to be in control, I think then we look at the responsibility of the church and the responsibility of the church's members as members of the body of Christ. And that is to bring shalom to the universe. We are priests and priestesses, cosmic temple dwellers. We're made, that's kind of synchronicity between the Garden of Eden and messianic time. It's where we're meant to rebuild Eden. We're meant to rebuild the structures of Edenic purity in our exile. And bringing shalom to your neighbor looks like what it looks like. There are secular examples of this, of people behaving, as Karl Rahner would say, as anonymous Christians, right? But the point is that the Holy Spirit is the one who inspires this kind of reaching out into the other. And I don't like using Levinisian language because I'm very much attached to Lacan, but looking into the face of the other and saying, I'm going to take time to cross that abyss of hyperconsumption, individualistic automatism, living in the iron cage of modernity. I'm going to break that barrier and say, I'm going to serve you. I'm going to live for the other. I think if everyone lived in messianic time, we would live in a different world. The cosmos would be transformed overnight. We could theoretically immanentize the eschaton. Nobody knows what would happen. The problem is we don't live in messianic time. The church has given up that mandate. It lives in secular time. And I think we have to fight back by reclaiming the day, so to speak, fighting for those moments of communion with God and fighting for those moments of communion with one another. I think once that does happen, the political transformation comes as a result of that. We see Dorothy Day's work. She lived in messianic time, right? And so I really do believe it's an organic growth process. And I speak right now as the hypocrite of all hypocrites, as the chief of all sinners, the one who doesn't live in messianic time, but aspires to.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Keanu. There's some, this is a little bit of a digression, but it's an interesting thing. There's been a really big resurgence of church activities where I live in Chicago and Gary, Indiana, because there's something really strange going on over the past 5 years where there's been an exponential growth in possessions. And so we have two of the Vatican's like 9 trained exorcists, right? And I was reading, actually 2 years ago, there was this lovely working class family that was living in Gary, Indiana. And this is only 2 years ago, and they were getting possessed or whatnot. And there's this huge resurgence of people going to these exorcists, and like 99% of them were never religious, right? It's almost like the church is becoming the spiritual firefighters for a demonic society in many ways. There's the experience of something deeply wrong, and not on even a material level, but some sort of spiritual degradation that seems to be kind of making its way through the collective psyche that I think is pretty interesting. But it also gives the church a new vocation, which is almost like demon hunter, which I think is pretty alarming and certainly interesting.
Come show me love. I'm so happy now because God has blessed this ghetto child. So now I smile from my lifestyle that I live this wild. And I repent my sins, show love to all my friends. And when they touch the pearly gates, I hope they get in. Waiting for Jesus. They call me crazy at times, even dumb with me. I'm just sitting on my porch waiting for Jesus to come. It may some traffic, but Lord, all I'm asking is for all my homies to come sit and wait for Jesus to come. They call me crazy at times, even dumb with me. I'm just sitting on my porch waiting for Jesus to come. It may some traffic, but Lord, all I'm asking is for all my homies to come sit and wait for Jesus to come. Reflect on life and the things that I've done. Waiting for Jesus to come. We love you, nigga. Rest in paradise. We just go get better than that.